Hello and welcome to NOWMORE Questions, the interview series that gets conversations started. In Cold War terms, securing sovereignty or strategic autonomy over the manufacturing of chips has become something of a space race. Only a handful of countries such as the United States, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, some EU countries and increasingly China have the specialized knowledge and capital-intensive manufacturing capacity needed to produce semiconductors. And out of those, Taiwan holds a very particular position, as it represented 63% of total manufacturing revenue for semiconductors globally in 2020. And this can be largely explained by the trend to outsource manufacturing capacity of semiconductors. But there has been something of a U-turn in the EU and the US with the publication of the EU Chips Act in February of 2022, and later in August, the Chips and Science Act published in the United States. These signal that semiconductors as foundational technologies are not only the backbone of economic performance in the digital age, but also of military and geopolitical power. With this in mind, in the third episode dedicated to the EU Chips Act of our series, I am joined by Christophe de la Taille. He is Professor of Microelectronics at the Ecole Polytechnique in Paris, and he is not here to represent any specific sector or organization, but rather to help us shed light on the central role of the chip in our complex, data-powered, digital and automated societies. Christophe, thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you for your invitation.
Now, Christophe, could you briefly give us a bit of background on your research and work in the field of semiconductors?
Okay, so I've been working in a academic research lab for something like a little more than 20 years now in chip design for particle physics, so instrumentation in particle physics. Which is at the very edge of instrumentation. And it's a very active domain, very international, and so very interesting. And as you said, I'm also professor of microelectronics, and I'm also now since 10 years co-founder of a startup company also in the chip design.
Okay, brilliant. So with that in mind, I hope that you can help us understand better the complex dynamics behind the chip. But before we get into that, it's our tradition in NOWMORE Questions to hand over the first question to our previous guest. That was Olivier de Matos, Director General of CropLife Europe, and he was interviewed on the topic of the sustainable use of pesticides.
So I would actually have two questions. The first one is why chips are important. Very basic question. I'm not familiar at all with the sector. The other one is about the semiconductor shortage. So what are the lessons learned from Europe's reaction to the global semiconductor shortage? It's been all over in the news, so that would be actually interesting to hear some thoughts about it.
Well, chips are important. Yes, of course, they probably without people knowing so much. For people, probably chips were essentially French fries, and without their knowing, they are actually everywhere. Inside, of course, you know probably inside your phone, in the past, you could open it to change the battery, and so you would see that there were also components. You probably would not know that exactly what there was inside, and probably if you look everywhere around you, so of course your computer that you know, your TV, your car, even an old car already had calculator and things like that, and so it's really a very important component of all our equipment that we have around us. So they are getting more and more complex. We see that everywhere. When you compare what your phone was doing even 10 years ago, and you cannot even find your way without it, unfortunately, nowadays. So there is much, much more inside that than what there was before. And so they are everywhere. And actually, coming to the second question, of course, we take them for granted, of course, and it's of course when they are missing that we realize how dependent we are on them, like on many things. Where when you are deprived from things, then you realize how important they were and they could not be taken for granted. You could probably, maybe you or me, because that we could probably survive a little bit with our mobile phone. I'm not sure the young generation could spend so long without it. But there are even also of course, in the security that we have everywhere around, to even in the finance market, the transaction, your money in the bank now is stored with chips. It's really relying. Lots of things are really based on their properly functioning. So no, it's extremely important, and of course, the security, sovereignty can be impacted. We have seen, of course, the importance of technology in the recent war in Ukraine, and so the fact that Ukraine could resist against against Russia was also thanks to a lot of technology coming from the West, and of course the technology is also heavily relies on the chips that we have inside. Again, almost everything, again, including the new weaponry.
Yeah, so you outline how important the chip is, and we can maybe go into a little bit more detail on some of the lessons learned from the European response to the shortage in semiconductors. But as you mentioned, when people talk about chips, they have in mind French fries, and I was quite struck when the EU released the EU Chips Act. There were in fact many jokes being made, mostly potato-related jokes about the chips, which somehow minimizes, in a way, its importance, and maybe shows how much people underestimate the power and the power play at play behind the chips. So before we go into that, I'd like to start with some basics, chips for dummies. Can you help us understand, number one, what are chips actually made of?
Okay, so chips are essentially made of silicon. So chip stands for microchip. Silicon microchip means it's a very small object, a few square millimeters. The largest will be square centimeter, but not much more than that. And on that little chip of silicon, you engrave millions of transistors. And so the transistors are like little switches that can let or not let the current go, and this way they would transport information. So that would be digital electronics. And there is another part of electronics. The transistor can also work in amplifying very small signals, in transforming the light that you get on your camera into, again, small signals, and making pictures, and all these kind of things. And so this is what you do with the chip. So you start from raw material, which sometimes people say this is silicone, so they say this is like the sand on the beach. Well, actually, it's a little more complex than that, because you need to purify to a very high degree the silicone that you use for semiconductors. Otherwise, the performance will not be there. But it's really silicone, and then you have to process that in again, complex and expensive factories that we call foundries. And these foundries, they process the material, and in the end, they provide what we call integrated circuits. Sometimes we call them ASICs, application-specific integrated circuits, and sometimes in the short term, we call them just chips.
And to give us a sense of how many chips one can find in different devices that we would probably have or hold or use on a daily basis, can you help us understand, how many chips would we find in an average smartphone?
Yeah, in almost all the equipment which is around you, you would find a few tens of chips. If you open your smartphone, if you fix your washing machine, like I like doing, or thing like that, you have something like a few tens. If you open your computer, you will also find a few, well, several tens, but not so many. And I did a little research when you asked the questions for the preparation in the car. So I have a very old car. So in my car, it's also a few tens, but there are already calculators and things like that. But I was surprised to see that in modern cars, it's several hundreds and up to thousands, and which was a little surprising to me. And which explains a little bit why the crisis was so acute for the cars. Because when you are relying only a few tens of chips, it's easier to secure their procurement. Now, if you have several hundreds, one is missing and the whole lot is not functioning anymore. And so this is probably why in the car industry was probably most affected, more than the rest probably that you saw. And what is interesting to see is that if you had opened your computer 10 or 20 years ago, you would have found several hundreds of chips. And in the last 10 or 20 years, they have been put together, let's say, so that there are fewer chips. It's the same in your smartphone. There are fewer chips so that they are more complex. So they try to do everything. So what used to be in many different chips, which are kind of generic, now is something which is very specific. I was mentioning ASIC, so application specific integrated circuit. This is really something which is we call that full custom design. So you really put everything inside the chip that you need to have, which is a little different from buying different parts and putting them together on what we call a board or a circuit. And so this is interesting. It's probably going to happen also in the car industry. That they are going to make something. So it's more expensive, especially at the beginning. But once you have your chip running for your application, then it's very, very efficient.
So, regardless of the number of chips, because they don't always tell the full story, you can have less chips but performing more roles or having more functions.
It's exactly
but
that.
what we would see is that what used to be mechanical has become increasingly automated and powered by chips, if I understand you correctly.
That's correct.
And if we go then into this question of shortages of chips that we've heard a lot of in the news, can you help us understand why we are facing such shortages? And why are there such disruptions in the supply chains? What are the key factors at play? Is it, according to you, a market failure? Or is it rather a signal of geopolitical power play and trade wars that is actually affecting then the way these materials and these chips are circulating through the globe and our societies?
So there, of course, I'm not an analyst, so that I have the outside, you would say, the outside knowledge. But of course, as this is my field of work, and I read, of course, everything on the subject, and I follow the subject very, very closely. So on the shortage, so the analysis which was done was that due to essentially at the beginning COVID, there was a sort of scissor effect of two things. So there was an increase in the demand of computers, appliances, so that people could work from home, so that the economy could continue even without people being at their working place. And on the other side, the offer was going down because the lockdown in Asia, the lockdown was very strongly enforced. And so factories were shut down for a long time and so on. And this was disrupting the supply chain. And so you see on one side, you have an increase of the demand for components. On the other side, the offer was going a bit down. And so, of course, then it came very acutely. It became very acute. This was, again, as I said at the beginning, worse for cars because they were relying on more components, and they had something more for the cars that they at the beginning of COVID, so the market for car was going down, and so the car industry, they canceled many orders to the chip companies. And when the demand came back, so of course the order, they were put on the bottom of the pile, and so then they came last, and they were requiring many components. So again, a few missing, and you still don't have the car running. So for the cars, it was a conjunction of factors. But I think it made people realize how fragile all the system was. So as you said at the beginning, people realized that only a few companies were really running the market. And most of them were, as you said, Taiwan is the lion's share in semiconductor industry. It's interesting. I have a small graph that I can show. You will show probably, showing that the share in semiconductor industry. If you look in the 1990s, so 30 years ago, it was roughly one third, one third, one third. Europe, US, Asia. And within 10 years, so if we reach 2000 something, US and Europe at the same time, so together, they went down from 30% to 10%. And at the same time, so Asia went up, and in particular, Taiwan. So Taiwan, South Korea, and now, since something like 10 years, mainland China is also going up quite a lot. So people realized that, of course, we were missing this critical part very, very accurately. And if problems now occurred in Taiwan, the whole industry would be jeopardized. And so that people try to go the other way around. So this is why you had this EU and also in the US, the CHIPS Act, to say, well, these very sensitive components, they need to come back to Europe and to the US. It's probably easier said than done.
Yeah. And this may help explain why there is so much attention being drawn to Taiwan, and Taiwan is such a peculiar country. In fact, it's not even internationally recognized as a country. It is actually internationally recognized as part of China, and maybe that also explains a lot of this. Absolutely. And if we look then at the response being given in the EU Chips Act, mostly we'll focus mostly on the EU. I think that the premise of the EU Chips Act is that Europe is strong when it comes to chip design and, let's say, fundamental research on chips and semiconductors. But there's a problem when it comes to manufacturing and developing applications for end markets. Do you agree with that premise? I mean, is that the right diagnosis? And is the EU Chips Act providing the right level of response? Do you believe that Europe is actually ready to invest and increase its manufacturing capacity?
So I believe the analysis is correct. So in the design, Europe and the US, we are very strong. In Europe, there is IMEC in Louvain-la-Neuve, in Leuven, which is really worldwide, has worldwide visibility and extremely good. From them, you also get all the equipment which is needed to make the chips, so to run the factory. And it's interesting to notice that this was a choice. So when we went from 30%, from 10%, at the beginning, it was a choice. There was much more added value in the design than in the fabrication. And so this is why it was found that it would be better to be outsourced and that we keep the noble part of designing. So this was true at the beginning, and as very often, things are not static. So what was true 30 years ago then changes. And so the added value has changed. And it was probably a bit naive to think that the fabrication would just be sent away and stay as it is. And people, sorry, when they started running, so in the Asia, in Taiwan in particular, when they started running these companies, they made a lot of innovation, they invested a lot, and also they succeeded because they were better. It's interesting to see that chips, it's not like t-shirts. They are not done in Asia because the labor is cheap. There are very few people working in foundries in these semiconductor factories. It's essentially robots. And so TSMC understood that very early. As soon as you have humans, you have contamination. You cannot have humans. And then you get poor yield. And so you cannot have humans. And so they invested a lot on the automatization of the foundries. And this is how they became the best. The quality was the best. And also the innovation that they continued has put them on the first rank. So sort of at the beginning a choice which has evolved, and people, even ourselves, we work in my lab, we work with TSMC and we are very happy with it. In the past, we used to work also with European foundries. Sorry to say, it was not as good. So I can say it's a bit of a pity, but it's something that you cannot deny. And so putting the foundries back is probably a good idea. So having back foundries in Europe and in the US, probably a good idea. It will not happen just by snapping fingers like that and putting money. It's you have to understand why the European foundries, they did not perform better. It's probably not only a money question, and it's something that at least I have seen also in the CHIPS Act, in the European CHIPS Act. It's a full ecosystem. It's not just a foundry that you put here, which is producing chips, and then the rest is business as usual. To be successful in the long term, you need very qualified manpower. You need a full ecosystem. You need to be close also to research, so that you continue being one step ahead. It's not just bringing a foundry and building it here. This is not a long-term thing. So what we are discussing is long-term. So it's long-term investment, long-term links with education, with research, so that the whole field is moving forward. So in the EU Chips Act, they acknowledge that there is one part which is called strengthening the links between industry and education and research. This is probably very important, and this is something which has been certainly missing in the past.
What's interesting in what you say is that it seems that beyond outsourcing manufacturing, we have outsourced manufacturing culture.
Yeah.
And in the case of semiconductors, what's interesting is that the actual manufacturing of the semiconductor is probably powered itself by semiconductors, because you mentioned that it's highly automated, robotized type of manufacturing.
Yeah.
So maybe manufacturing culture goes hand in hand with chip design, much more than just investing on chip design.
Yeah.
If I look then at the end markets, what we see is that in different parts of the world, we're manufacturing for very different end markets, as I understand it. In the Americas and China, the biggest markets for semiconductors seem to be computers, storage, mobile and consumer applications. So really the mass market, let's say. Whereas in Europe and Japan, what you see is that they're rather found in automotive and industrial sectors.
Yeah.
Why is that? So why is there such a difference in end markets? And what kind of future markets do you think will be driving the growth for the uptake of semiconductors? Because I think that's also important to understand how strategic they might become.
So your picture is correct. So indeed, computer, mobile, and all these things are manufactured in Asia. I think this is because we have been discussing the chips, which is really the heart of the devices, so your mobile phone and but it does not come alone. So it comes on what we call PCBs, printed circuit boards, which are making connections between components, and there's a lot of stuff around it. So this is, you would say, more labor intensive, more traditional electronics. And so this part, the cheaper labor, it's something which is not always very environment friendly. So these factories, and so they have been outsourced for probably this kind of reasons. I think and it's a fact that, again, if we bring back semiconductor companies in Europe, then we are also missing now in Europe again the PCB manufacturer, the assembly companies. We are not completely missing them. We have some of them, but again, the quality is not the same now as in Asia. In the past, it was the contrary. So we were keeping the highest level of PCBs, and now this is more or less the contrary. So we have lost the technological advantage because we are not doing enough of them. And so this part is in Asia, and I think in Europe we have kept the automotive, and it probably relates essentially to the way of industry in Europe, and so it was principally Germany. You know that France, UK, and so on, they have more invested in services, in finance, or different domains. So industry is more in Germany, and probably this car, BMW, Mercedes, and they are still the high end of industry. And so they like, again, like the others, to keep their chain of supply not too far away. So this probably reflects this part. So now on the future, so I don't have my crystal ball, of course, but following so in research, what we see, the advances that we see in research, well, clearly robotics is going to change a lot our everyday life in the coming decades. You see the drones when you look at the news. You see everything which is automatic now and which is completely aided. So your plane now is landing essentially on its own. You get diagnostics which are computer aided, and you see what the robots they are doing is impressive. You have humanoids robot, but you also have less spectacular little robot that can help in surgery, that can explore difficult areas. It's a domain which is going to probably to ramp up a lot. And all these kind of things, even like cars, they rely on having lots of sensors. You need to see, for example, imagine the self-driving car. It's completely full with sensors, radars, lidars, and getting the information of what's happening around to take the correct decision. And so transforming the information into electrical signals, so this is again done in chips. And so they will be more and more complex, more and more integrated, and this will rely much more on chips. So if we keep the ecosystem in Europe again, if the Chips Act is not just building a foundry and giving a lot of money to very big companies, but also again favoring the whole ecosystem which goes around, reading these sensors and making highly integrated circuits that can process all this data. Yeah, probably there we can find back our place. But again, it's a thing that sometimes politicians or managers they don't like. It's long-term thing. It's not just the magic wand and you do something and immediately it does some effect. it's a long-term investment. It's probably less rewarding, but it's very long-term, and it's also something that again, managers and politicians that don't like so much. It's supporting running things. People they love to create new things, but what exists, and for example, I talked about IMEC at the beginning, which is very good, very efficient, supporting it so that it continues running and being at the forefront of the research is probably even more important as creating new things, but that's sometimes difficult for managers.
And in the beginning, I made the comparison with the space race, during the Cold War.
Oh yeah.
And I'd like to just finish on that, because we do have this very strong geopolitical backdrop to the whole policy and discussion around chips. And the kind of applications that you're talking about moving forwards, and the kind of future breakthroughs that you expect through robotization, automation, artificial intelligence, sensors. I mean, this breathes with control. So whoever controls this will control a lot of people. So this notion of control, I think, is very strong. And whereas the space race, to some extent, was largely symbolic, the race for chips is much more directly linked to really things like population control. And we like to think that we're in a democracy. So I'd just like to get your thoughts on this. Is the EU Chips Act, can we expect that a realistic outcome of the EU Chips Act is that the EU will be able to get a little bit more sovereignty over its democracy? Or do you think that we're headed towards a situation where, global powers will, and maybe even corporate power, will hold more power than certain democracies over people?
So you have a question probably way out of my league here, because I am more in the technical part, and I think it even relates to the next topic that you will bring on the way the media are controlled and things like that. So it's all, again, exactly as you said, around control. There are the two sides of the coin, as usual. So, of course, I hope that it will be for the benefit of democracy, but it's very difficult to say whether it can be at some point completely taken over by private interests. And it's almost impossible to say on what way it will go. So I hope that this kind of question and the democracy, how we can have more democracy, and it essentially goes through education. We go back to education and the links between education and industry. That all comes back, in my opinion, to that part. The rest is unpredictable.
No, I fully understand that it's not something that you would be comfortable to answer, and you are doing your research. But I think what you're saying is that people should be aware of the importance and highly strategic aspect of chips that does deserve more than potato-related jokes. I think on that, Christophe,
absolutely,
we can agree.
I think the shortage also helped politicians realize, and even the general public realize how critical this issue is, and coming exactly to what you are saying on the control.
Thank you so much, Christophe, for having shared these insights with us. It was highly interesting. I've had quite a bit of feedback on the previous episodes that people still don't quite understand what chips are all about. It takes time to understand how this technology works, what's behind it, why is it important. I think you've been really helpful in bringing some clarity to that. So thank you for having taken the time to be with us.
Thank you for your invitation again. My pleasure.
That was Christophe de la Taille, our third guest on the topic of the EU Chips Act. You can discover all our previous interviews on the topic and more on our NOWMORE YouTube channel and on the NOWMORE website. And do please follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter to get the latest updates on our new interviews.